What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode on the Highlanders Workshop, where we workshop our commander decks, our commander strategies, and everything else in between that you need to have the most success. Today, we're doing another deck spotlight video, and this is a very special one to me. This is a deck that is very near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. Probably my favorite of my 20 plus EDH decks that I own, and that is Purphoros Bronze Blooded. Now, the main reason that this is probably my favorite deck is because Sneak Attack is my favorite Magic card of all time. And Sneak Attack, this is not, but it's close. Purphoros Bronze Blooded, not to be confused with his predecessor, the original Purphoros, which everybody is, I think, highly familiar with. If you've ever played against any kind of red tokens deck, you've probably dealt with the original Purphoros, which pings everybody for damage. This one is not so universally salt-inducing. It's just a great card that, again, reminds me of my favorite Magic card. So Purphoros Bronze Blooded has the same indestructible, the same not a creature unless your devotion is 5 or more as the original Purphoros, but with the new abilities of other creatures you control have haste, and you can pay a red and 2 colorless to put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is basically Sneak Attack on a stick, but it's indestructible, and you can have it in your command zone, but with a much more fair activation cost. For those of you who are familiar with Sneak Attack, you know it's only 1 red to put any creature from your hand onto the battlefield. Purphoros Bronze Blooded even keeps you a little more honest because if you'll notice, it specifies that it has to be a red or artifact creature, so you can't even do Eldrazi's shenanigans with this, as they are just colorless. They're not artifacts. So, Purphoros Bronze Blooded, my favorite card in the command zone. How could I resist, right? This is also the only deck I took with me on a recent trip to Spain, which, by the way, Barcelona, if anybody's ever in Barcelona, fantastic commander community out there. I wish I had brought more than one deck, but I was a little nervous about traveling with my Magic cards, and of course packing space is limited, and Magic cards are heavy and bulky. So I brought this deck with me and did quite well on the Barcelona scene. So without further ado, let's get into what makes this deck so fun and special. Now, obviously, from what the commander does, you figure it's going to be a very creature-heavy deck, and it is. You can see we have 38 creatures in the deck, so more than a third of the deck is creatures. Now, philosophically, there's a number of ways you could approach this deck. I think when people see this commander, the first thing they assume is this is just going to be a straight-up savage mono-red beatdown type deck, and they are half right. But I didn't want to just build a deck that is just, you know, kill or be killed, throw all the heat on the board, you know, and either die or end games in, 20 minutes. There are, for sure, some beat sticks in here, as I'm sure you can see already with just the cards that we have revealed here, but I wanted those capabilities, of course, to end games, but I also wanted a deck that I could play. I could play through the early and mid game. So there's a lot of utility creatures in here, a lot of toolbox creatures, because what Purphoros does is, because of the activated ability being instant speed, it kind of turns you into like a mono-red draw-go deck, almost like a mono-red deck that's masquerading as a mono-blue deck, because you can just hold all your mana up and hold cards in your hand and just hold up Purphoros activations to respond to whatever you need to respond to. When the time comes, you can spam the board to beat face, but in the meantime, you're holding up things like Dualcaster Mage and Direfleet Daredevil and all these kinds of things that are more functional abilities than just, getting damage off. So it's a lot of fun to play. It really unnerves people when you're in the mid game with 9, 10, 12 mana and you're just laying a land and passing turn, and people are just staring at Purphoros and a bunch of open mana. It really does get into people's heads after a little while, wondering what I'm going to do, how much longer I'm going to stay passive, when is the beatdown coming, what do I have? It's a blast. And on that note, actually, before we get into the meat of the deck, I was honestly surprised. There was a game a little while back where some people were pulling out, borderline CEDH, really competitive decks, and this was the best thing I had to combat that, and I didn't really know how it was going to fare. And let me just say that it did a lot better than I thought because of one major thing, and that is, since Purphoros is allowing you to cheat your creatures out with activated abilities, that is with his activated ability, I'm sorry, that's very noteworthy because since you don't have to cast your creatures, you dodge counter magic. And as anyone who's ever played CEDH or against any really competitive commander decks, counter magic is very, very prevalent in the competitive scene. So I didn't realize that landing Purphoros on the board was going to create such an advantage for me against a couple of very counterspell heavy decks that were frankly kind of powerless to stop what I was doing once I resolved my commander. I don't think they realized it either, because there were a couple times where they tried to counter creatures that I spat out with Purphoros, and I had to remind them that these creatures were here due to an activated ability, not a cast. So, fun fact there, you can kind of punch up with Purphoros if you can resolve them. Anyway, let's get down to the nitty-gritty and just kind of go card by card and talk about why these things are in here. We'll spend more time on some than others, but starting with Avalanche Riders. Taboo, maybe. I don't know how people out there feel about land destruction. I know how people feel about mass land destruction, and it's not a popular thing. But that being said, I think spot land destruction should be perfectly acceptable to anybody. It's not like you're resetting the game or neutralizing anybody's capabilities of playing the game. Avalanche Riders in here to take out, Gaia's Cradles and Nykthos, Maze of Ith. This is a deck that's generally going to be pretty dependent on combat damage to try to win a game. So taking out Maze of Ith, taking out Glacial Chasm, those kinds of things that can be detrimental to your strategy. That's part of the reality of Commander. There are lands that are very, very, very relevant to the flow of a game, and Avalanche Riders is in here to snipe those. Avatar of Slaughter, my literal namesake, as you can see from my Moxfield handle. I just think this is one of the most hardcore Magic cards of all time, so if I'm building a mono red deck that's going to be built around the beatdown to win, how could I not run Avatar of Slaughter? It's just savage. All creatures have double strike and attack each combat if able. It doesn't give a shit. It wants violence. I mean, look at the flavor text. Diplomacy has solved nothing. Only Bloodspill can end this now. Call forth the Warbringer. And that is how we use this card in this deck. When it's time to go, when it's time to murder, this is the card we want on the battlefield. Balor is fun because it has an attack trigger as well as a Dias trigger, and with Purphoros, these things are going to die right away, so you get 2-for-1 value out of Balor if you're swinging with them. Bosch Iron Golem, a classic EDH staple. Not the most mana efficient, but again, since we're cheating out most of these creatures at the cost of 3 mana, that obviously makes Bosch a lot more cost effective and a very effective way to end games. As you'll notice as we go through this list, this deck has quite a few considerably pricey artifacts, in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 mana plus. So that Bosch activated ability can add up really quick when you're trying to close out a game, especially if you need to get around something like Maze of Ith or Turbo Fog, where they're preventing combat damage, Bosch can still give you a way to send lethal damage through without combat. Burnished Heart is just a ramp piece, but it's fun to spit out with Purphoros and do it at the end of someone's turn. If anybody who's ever cast a Burnished Heart on turn 3 knows, it's very nerve-wracking to tap out to play your Burnished Heart without the ability to sacrifice it right away. You got to hope it survives till the next round. So Purphoros gives you the comfort of just kind of zipping it out there at instant speed to make it more likely that you're going to get this off. Caldera Helion is one of our soft wipes that are in here. It's 3 damage to each creature when it enters the battlefield. Combustible Gearhulk is, generally speaking, a card option, but it can do quite a bit of damage. Anybody who chooses to take the total damage of the 3 cards instead of letting me draw the cards with this is taking their life into their hands. As you can imagine, the average mana value in this deck is quite high. So I've seen Combustible Gearhulk do 15 plus damage more often than you might think when people choose to roll the dice and take the damage instead of giving me the cards. Conquering Manticore, there's a number of these types of threaten effect on a stick cards in here because that is just a very powerful thing to be able to do at instant speed. Crater Helion, another soft wipe, 4 damage to each creature when it enters the battlefield. Direfleet Daredevil, being able to snipe an instant out of someone's graveyard to respond to something. This basically gives you access to your opponent's counter magic since you can perf it out on anyone's turn. And then, of course, on your own turn as well for spicy sorceries or whatnot. But just a very, very versatile toolbox card here, especially when it can come out at instant speed. Dragon Mage, just a wheel on a stick. Obviously, mono red needs to work at drawing cards. It's not as easy as red as it is for some of the other colors. I would argue mono red is probably the second worst color at drawing cards besides white. So, we're going to get card draw in here any way we can, and it's a 5/5 flying body, so why not? Drakaseth, just a straight-up beat stick, attacking, spreading damage all over the place, doing 7 damage in the air, fantastic stuff. Dualcaster Mage sees a slight value uptick. Obviously, it costs 3 mana to cast this thing, it costs 3 mana to activate Purphoros, so it's kind of a wash cost-wise, but as I mentioned earlier, you get the added benefit of not having to actually cast the Dualcaster Mage. So you can dodge interaction with it that way slightly. Duplicant is just instant speed removal in this deck. Very, very powerful. Feldon, obviously, due to the sacrifice at the beginning of the end step clause that Purphoros comes with, a lot of our stuff is going to be dying. So we need reliable ways to interact with our own graveyard, and Feldon is a fantastic way to do that. Speaking of that, Goblin Welder, a lot of these creatures are artifacts, and there's a lot of other non-creature artifacts in the deck as well, so Goblin Welder will do a lot of work. It's also nice that Welder can get back your things that have already died, but it can also sort of utilize a creature that is, on its way out anyway. Let's say we've perfed a duplicant into play and it's going to get sacrificed at the beginning of the end step anyway. Well, Goblin Welder lets you sack it for purpose and make his death not in vain. So there's a number of cards in here as well that do that sort of thing. Either sacrifice a creature that would have been on its way out anyway, or saving the creature outright. We'll see a couple of those things as well. Heartless Hidetsugu, let me take a little time to talk about this because this is one of the most effective win conditions in the deck. The way that Purphoros' ability is worded says sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step, of course. So like Sneak Attack, you can wait until the opponent who takes their turn right before you to move into their end step. And then once they're in their end step, whatever you put into play with Purphoros will stay in play throughout the duration of your own turn and get sacrificed at the beginning of your end step. So if you do that with Hidetsugu, him having haste, you get 2 activations instead of 1 off of Hidetsugu if you put it in on your previous opponent's end step. So you can put Hidetsugu in, activate it immediately, go to your turn, untap, and activate Hidetsugu again. So for those of you who are bad at math, if everyone's at 40 and you do that, all of a sudden everyone's at 10. You cut their life in half, and then you cut their life in half again. And that's if you can only do it twice. There's a couple of ways to bounce Hidetsugu or sacrifice him and bring him back to life, like if you've got a Feldon out, where you could easily get a third activation off. Now, after the second activation, obviously it's diminishing returns. Going from 40 to 20 is a huge deal. Going from 20 to 10 is still a pretty big deal. Going from 10 to 5, that's still 15 damage if you consider you're doing it to 3 opponents. But that can really, really send things home. I've won many, many games with this deck just on people thinking, oh, we're all in our 30s still, no one's close to death, everything's going to be chill, and then Hidetsugu comes out and does his thing. Hamura, Human Ascendant. Really, really fun thing to just zip in with Purphoros because this is a creature that we want to die. As a creature, he's just a 4/4 who can't block. Not very exciting. But for those of you who can't read upside down, I'll tell you that when he dies, he flips into a legendary enchantment that says creatures you control get +2/+2 and have flying and fire breathing. All of your creatures. So just perfing this out for whatever purpose, just to die or to have something to sacrifice, whatever. You just want this thing dead. So perfing it out and getting a really, really sweet enchantment on the board as a result is a lot of fun. Humble Defector, again, red card draw. This is also a fun political card. You can negotiate with people to just hand it back and forth between you and them, and then you're each drawing 2 extra cards on your own turn. This card creates some fun political environments. Ignition Team falls into the category of just very, very large creatures, obviously. There's a Warstorm Surge in this deck, so a lot of value on bigger bodies, and then plus, of course, it can attack. So there's that, too. Ilharg the Razebore, just when you're ready to beat face, this is something you really, really want on the board. It saves you the mana of 1 Purphoros activation because of its attack trigger. And, even though Purphoros makes you sacrifice it, Ilharg will just keep coming back because of its god ability of tucking itself into your library when it would die. Or, yes. So there's that. Imperial Recruiter, you might think, oh, this deck's full of large creatures, but really it's got a bunch of tiny ones too. So you can get Feldon and Goblin Welder and a number of other things with Imperial Recruiter. So just an instant speed tutor with Purphoros, good stuff. Magus for card draw, Metalwork Colossus for a large creature. Also, the sacrifice 2 artifacts, return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand can be very relevant, especially in the late game. Especially if you've got creatures that are about to get sacrificed anyway, you can do that to Metalwork Colossus to get it back. Meteor Golem, more instant speed removal, any non-land permanent is sick. Molten Primordial, a multifaceted threat and effect because it takes 1 from each opponent when it comes into play. So this can represent a lot of damage when you're ready to start trying to alpha strike people. Same with Mirror Battlesphere, puts a lot of bodies on the board. Also good to Purphoros in early if you need to, especially if you need to defend yourself or just kind of go wide, because even though you'll have to sacrifice the Battlesphere to the Purphoros delayed effect, you get to keep the 4 mirror tokens that it makes. So if you just need to get bodies on the board, that's a good way to do it. Same thing with Penavus, being able to shove this out at instant speed and just unload a bunch of flying blockers that also don't die when the Penavus dies is pretty valuable. Especially if you've got something like the Hamura flipped enchantment on the board. All of a sudden those 1/1s are 3/3s, and yeah, that's good stuff. Phyrexian Triniform, more big bodies that encores for more big bodies and dies to make medium bodies. Pilgrim's Eye, look, just like Red's not really great at drawing cards, Red's also not really great at ramping, unless you want to go the whole ritual type effects that Red has. We don't do that in this deck, really, except for Jeska's Will. So, we've got to get them land drops, and whatever, it's a flyer. Platinum Empyrean, a really fun thing to do at instant speed when someone's trying to kill you. If a Giant Exsanguinate is about to happen, if you're about to get alpha struck, perfing this thing in at instant speed can be quite the gotcha moment. Plundering Barbarian, a very basic card, but very functional. Just getting the treasure token sometimes will get you that extra mana you need, and then of course it destroys an artifact, so sometimes you need to do that. Sandstone Oracle, more card draw. Scuttling Doom Engine, an underplayed card in Commander, possibly for good reason, but a pet card of mine because it can get a lot of damage going. Can't be blocked with creatures with power 2 or less, and when it dies, it deals 6 damage to target opponent. So if you can get this thing on and off the board a number of times with something like Goblin Welder or Feldbomb, that 6 damage adds up pretty quickly. Shrieking Bog, one of my favorite cards in the entire deck. I love when I get to put a card in a Commander deck that is terrible otherwise in the format, but very good specifically in the deck you've put it in. And Shrieking Bog is a fantastic example of that. Because if you're just casting this thing at normal timing, sorcery speed, it's a 1/1 haste, but when it enters the battlefield, you tap all other creatures, of course, including your own. So generally speaking, at sorcery speed, this card is not very good. But when you can Purphoros it in on anyone's turn, this becomes a red fog, and that's really sick. Solemn is in here for obvious reasons. Wormcoil Engine, just another great beat stick that's a body that creates more bodies when it dies. Anything that gives you value on the way out is important in Purphoros. Zealous Conscripts, another threaten effect, but this can take any permanent until end of turn, which is pretty sick. So that's our roster of creatures, the beat sticks and the toolbox pieces. A lot of fun. Now let's get into some of our non-creature support. Chandra's Ignition is a great board wipe and also can be a kill card because it does do damage to the opponents as well as their creatures. Jeska's Will, I mean, what can I say? This card is one of the hottest items in Commander since it came out, and for good reason. This can give you a leg up very early. It can give you a boost late. Speaking of things that can give you a serious boost in the mana base, in the mid to late game, Mana Geyser will very frequently give you upwards of 15 to 20 mana, so you can really pop off with this sucker. We got another wheel effect here, Vandal Blast for some interaction. Don't ever build a deck. I mean, you do what you want, but I don't ever build decks that don't have a fair amount of interaction. You know, I see more and more people these days that are just building a deck to do its thing and aren't really trying to stop their opponents from doing their thing. You're just trying to get off before your opponent does. I don't believe in that. I think you always need to have interaction. So Vandal Blast is a very, very effective way to take those other artifacts decks down to size. And nowadays, with treasure being as prevalent as it is, you don't even have to be an artifact deck to have a lot of artifacts on the battlefield. So Vandal Blast can really trim that stuff down. Moving on to our artifacts, we have a horrible mana rock, but I don't care. Normally, I try to focus on mana rocks that have a casting cost of 2. I believe in ramping as quick as possible if you're going to be ramping. But since Purphoros is a 5 mana commander, ramping on turn 2 or ramping on turn 3 still just means you're getting Purphoros on turn 4. So I kind of loosened that way of thinking for this deck because, like I said, ramping on turn 3 is about as effective for getting Purphoros out early as ramping on turn 2 is. And this, gives you another option to draw a card. Like I said, you're spending a lot of time with this deck just laying a land and passing turn, and if you pass all around and nobody has forced you to activate Purphoros to react to what they're doing, sometimes you just have a lot of mana left open when your turn is about to start. So 4 mana to tap this and draw a card, things like that, just give you something to do with your mana if no one else forced you to use it. Culling Deus, a great way to get some card advantage by sacking creatures that are going to be on their way out anyway. Erratic Portal, don't want to sack that creature? Bounce it instead. Pay 1 mana to return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1 mana. Most of the time, Erratic Portal is just returning your own stuff to your hand because as the controller of the creature, you have the option to not pay the 1 mana. So this is generally in here to save your own stuff. Every now and then you'll catch somebody tapping out and you can gotcha them. If they don't have the 1 mana to pay, you can bounce one of their things and really inconvenience them. But like I said, more often than not, this is just in here to perf a creature out, get its value, and then use this to put the creature back in your hand so you can do it again. Again, this is the kind of card that will give you, that extra Hidetsugu activation if you need it, or whatever. Ever-Flowing Chalice, a nice versatile mana rock. Godpharaoh's Gift, another way to take advantage of the fact that a lot of our creatures are dying, because this will just start pulling them back out of your graveyard and giving you bonus value. Jeweled Lotus, of course. I don't think I need to really explain why this card is in here. This allows you to have turn 2 Purphoros, and then on turn 3, you've got 3 mana ready for your first Purphoros activation. Liquid Metal Torque, another great mana rock that turns something into an artifact. Mimic Vat, again, another thing to take advantage of the fact that our creatures are going to be dying pretty often. We can allow them to die and throw them on the Mimic Vat to get some additional value off of their dead bodies. Mind Stone, mana rock draw card. Mind's Eye, a very slow, but once it gets rolling, very, very effective way to draw cards. It is 5 mana to get out, but being able to pay 1 mana at a time every time an opponent draws a card for anything to gas your hand back up. Even if you got to tap out to play this thing, that feels bad, but trust me, once you untap with it and then pass turn with a bunch of mana open, it's going to feel pretty good. Rozka Relic, another 3 mana rock that can draw us a card if we need to. Soul Ring, Trading Post. I mean, just one of the most versatile cards in the format. It's hard to even think of a deck that Trading Post wouldn't be at least decent in. But between the 4 modes on this card, it is going to provide at least moderate value for almost every EDH deck you can think of. And then Worn Power Stone, just another solid mana rock. The enchantments in this deck are really fun. I love all 5 of these enchantments. Industrial Advancement, love may be a strong word for it, but it's a cool card. Anyway, let's talk about these enchantments. Fires of Invention. Oh boy, what a fun card. For those of you who remember the days of Eldraine Standard, this card was quite powerful to the point where it had to be banned in the format, actually. What it says is it's a 4 mana enchantment, and it says you can cast spells only during your turn, and you can cast no more than 2 spells each turn. But it says you may cast spells with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana costs. So let's talk about the drawbacks of this card first. You can only cast 2 spells a turn, and you can only cast spells on your turn. Well, if we go through and we look at all these categories we've got here, creatures, sorceries, artifacts, enchantments, lands, what are we missing? We're missing instants. So we don't actually care about not being able to cast on other people's turns, because we're just trying to activate Purphoros on other people's turns. So no biggie, that eliminates that drawback altogether immediately. What about the other drawback? Oh, you can only cast 2 spells each turn? Well, again, generally speaking, we're trying to hold up the bulk of our resources to do things on other people's turns. So getting to drop 2 free cards on your own turn, man, is just gas, man. It doesn't even matter if they're not powerful. Let's just say you're just like, okay, I'll drop a couple of free mana rocks on my turn, and still have all my mana up to do Purphoros activations. This card is nuts, man. Big fan of this card. Glacial Crevices is one of only 2 cards in the deck that are the reason that we have snow-covered mountains in the deck, but it allows you to sacrifice a snow-covered mountain to fog. So just like the Shrieking Maw, we've got another mono-red fog here. Goblin Bombardment, I mean, one of the most infamous red enchantments in all of Magic, and yet another way to take advantage of creatures that are going to be on their way out anyway. I don't think we need to go too deep into validating the power and presence of Goblin Bombardment. The one that I dissed, I didn't really diss it, but it's a fine card. Industrial Advancement is another way to take advantage of creatures that are on their way out anyway due to Purphoros. It is a simultaneous at the beginning of your end step sacrifice a creature trigger, but because you control both triggers, the Purphoros delayed trigger and the Industrial Advancement trigger, you can stack this ahead to sacrifice the creature to Industrial Advancement instead of sacking it just because it has to be sacrificed for Purphoros. You get a little value on that creature on the way out. If you do look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the creature's mana value, you may put a creature card from among those cards onto the battlefield. So this can be a good value piece later in the game. Warstorm Surge, this is a game ender. Anytime a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So obviously at the rate at which we are spamming the board with potentially very, very large creatures, Warstorm Surge can do a lot of damage. This has been a straight up win condition for me in the past. And finally, we've got the lands. Not too much to talk about here, but a few notable utility lands. Blast Zone. This card has kind of underwhelmed me in the past, but it's in here as a just-in-case moment. Bonder's Enclave is more card draw. Haunted Fengraf gets a creature back at random from your graveyard. Sometimes you just really want to do that late in the game. Labyrinth of Scophos, you know, a mid version of Maze of Ith, but again, since you are generally leaving the bulk of your mana open every round, just having this out for threat of activation, a lot of times you don't even end up having to use it. Just the fact that you could use it will generally deter people from attacking you and making you use it, unless the whole board is just teaming up against you and one guy is like, oh, I'll make him use it, so you know it'll be tapped for the next time. But threat of activation, a very important thing to consider when considering cards in your commander deck. Phyrexia's Core, just another thing to sack things that are on their way out anyway. Rogue's Passage, obviously, can make one of your big scaries unblockable. Sanctum of Eugene, we've got it. Ugin, but I call him Eugene. There's a few things in the deck that will trigger this if you need to go get a colorless creature card. There's a number of those in the deck, so this can be valuable. Scavenger Grounds to have some graveyard interaction because you've just got to run Graveyard Hate in commander decks. Scrying Sheets, the other card that cares about snow lands in this deck, is a 1 in 4 chance basically to draw a card. It's not the greatest, but hey, it's in the mana base. We've got a lot of colorless cards in this deck anyway, so it costs you practically nothing to have Scrying Sheets in your deck. Tom of the Spirit Dragon. I know it's Tomb, but I call him Tom like it's a buddy. Hey, Tom! Tom of the Spirit Dragon! A long time no see. Anyway, we got quite a number of colorless things in this deck, so this can represent some life gain in mono red. And then finally, War Room just draws you another card. So that is Purphoros Bronze Blooded, my favorite commander deck. Just a lot of fun to play and a very, very effective deck. In the record keeping that I've done in the past, this is one of my decks that has the best win rate all time. As you can see, $359, and the bulk of that cost is just a Jeweled Lotus, Scrying Sheets, and like Jeska's Will. You know, there's 3 or 4 fairly expensive cards in this deck. Without those cards, this deck quickly drops down to, you know, under $200. And yet an immensely effective, fun, and powerful deck. I hope you guys have enjoyed this deck spotlight. I hope it's given you some inspiration. If you have any questions about cards that are in here, about cards that aren't in here that you think I should put in, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time at the Highlanders Workshop.